Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us. On the line is one of our good friends, Mike Rivero from whatreallyhappened.com. He's been kind enough to join us again, live from Hawaii. Mike, how are you?
Aloha nui nui. How are you doing?
Oh, we're hanging in there. And also on the line is Rory, our contributor from SGT Report, who helped set this call up. Thank you for doing that, Rory.
No problem. My pleasure.
Well, it's my pleasure to have Mike on. And Mike, we can talk about so many things. I want to ask you a little bit about Fukushima, too, at some point here, because you're sort of in the trajectory of any plumes maybe coming off of Fukushima might hit Hawaii there. I want to lead with this, gentlemen. I think it's very interesting that once again, the mainstream dinosaur Mockingbird media has validated the existence of BeforeIt'sNews.com and SGTReport.com by not reporting last week about the leaked phone call between EU Foreign Affairs head Catherine Ashton and Estonian Foreign Minister Urmas Paet, which indicated that the snipers who murdered Ukrainians in Kiev were under the direction of the Maidan leaders, not Yanukovych. I found it astounding. On the day that news broke, I read it at Zero Hedge. We reported on it and shared it with our readers. And that night at the club on the treadmill, I tuned into CNN and Fox News, and neither of them reported on it. But they were more than happy to report on the Oscar Pistorius murder trial, as though it's some matter of national security. Mike, I got to tell you, thank God for whatreallyhappened.com and Truthful News, huh?
Well, definitely, thank goodness for the independent media here. Now, to be very honest, CNN did finally mention this on their website, but you're absolutely correct. The TV news has absolutely ignored this story. They received their marching orders to demonize Russia and justify military intervention. I'm even getting emails from people who watch The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and they're just turning him off because all week long he's just out there making fun of Putin and Russia and just say, yes, the Ukraine, we got to go in there. And they definitely have their marching orders over there at the controlled media. It is, again, this idea that the people committing the atrocities used to demonize the targeted government are actually under the control of the coup d'etat. There's nothing new about that. It's a standard part of the CIA's cookbook for overthrowing friendly governments. And I think the reason we're seeing so little public support in the United States for an adventure in the Ukraine is the American people are now aware. This is what's really been going on. This is what the U.S. government's been doing for the last 50 years. They don't invade nations. They covertly go in, create a crisis and a coup d'etat masquerading as a revolution. They kick out the old government, install a new one by force, say it's a victory for democracy, and start looting the wealth of that nation like crazy. We saw that certainly down in Chile when the CIA ousted the elected government of Allende and installed the dictator Pinochet. We saw it in Iran in 1953 when the CIA ousted the elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah. But it's rather interesting because it took the Iranian people 26 years between the covert U.S. overthrow of their elected government before they finally realized what was going on and kicked out the Shah in 1979. These days, the fact that we're seeing these counter-revolutions, and we're seeing it in Libya right now, the U.S. puppet regime there is on the verge of collapse. It's taking much, much less time, and that tells me that the people of the world have basically picked up on what the scam has been all along.
Now, we saw with the war drums that we're beating to take this country into more war, this time in Syria, with John Kerry leading the charge for the Obama administration, we saw the American people stand up and say, hell no. Is this what an awakening looks like, Michael? Because from my perspective, from an educated perspective about the Federal Reserve, the private banking system, the banksters, the international criminal cartel that profits from these wars, most of the friends and neighbors and colleagues that I have still can't articulate what I just said. Most people don't know that the Federal Reserve is private. They cannot articulate the things that you and I and Rory talk about on a regular basis. That said, they are waking up fast enough to realize that more war equals bad stuff for their lives, for the immediacy, and for the national security of our country. We don't need more war. Is this what an awakening looks like, that people are waking up and they can't necessarily articulate why or what the problem is?
Yeah, because the first stage is you start realizing at a gut level something has gone horribly wrong. And a lot of people are very scared by that, and they're trying to cling to their belief that our nation is the good guys. And but slowly, bit by bit, as the evidence before their own eyes mounts, they start to realize something has gone wrong, and they reach a point where they start abandoning those beliefs that we were all brainwashed to cling to in grade school, and they start going out and finding things. And so across America, there's a continuum between those who are still blindly desperate to cling to the illusions that they were raised with, up to people like you and I, and everybody sort of fits somewhere on that continuum. Some people know the wars are wrong. They don't understand the motives behind them. Then you go a little further along. People have been in the truth movement a little longer, and they understand it's all driven by the bankers. And it's getting out there. I understand that the video version of my article, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, was actually on Comcast TV in Marin County this week. So it's definitely getting out there. I know the numbers on the video in the original article are very high. It's been copied off all over the place. So people are picking up on the fact that American history, in terms of its wars and assassinations and coups d'etats, has been driven by this ongoing effort by the private central banks to keep their little debt currency scam working, to keep us all enslaved to impossible to pay off debt in order to control us. And I think this global awakening is just the realization of the people of the world that once you are sold into the slavery of a private central bank, which by design creates more debt than money with which to pay that debt, it is a slave trap, and people are getting very unhappy with that. We're seeing that certainly, as I mentioned before, in Libya. Gaddafi had a state central bank and a value-based currency, the gold dinar. That was a threat to the private central bankers, so we invade, we kill Gaddafi, destroy the gold dinar, give them a private central bank, and plunge them all back into debt. But the Libyan people, they're attacking their Congress. Two of them were shot and wounded. The Congress is now meeting in a hotel. They don't even dare go to their legislative parliamentary building. And you're not seeing a lot of that on the TV news because Libya is in a very interesting situation. These newly overthrown countries have come to understand that they actually have a window of opportunity where they can take their country back, and the U.S. can't do a thing about it. Because can you imagine Obama getting up on the TV and saying, well, those Libyan people, they just kicked out their U.S. puppet government, so we have to invade them a second time. That's not going to go over very well with the American people.
You know, when we think about the people standing up in this country to say hell no to more war in Syria, and you alluded to the fact that there's no support really by the American people for any actions in the Ukraine, and thank God for that. Don't you find it fascinating now that Vladimir Putin has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize? I mean, let's contrast that against the former Peace Prize winner, Obama.
Well, Putin has been nominated for the Peace Prize because of what he did in Syria to prevent a war, which means he actually earned his, as opposed to Obama, who sort of got it as a prize out of a Cracker Jacks box just for winning the American election. The Peace Prize really has been discredited in recent years. They gave it to Al Gore for global warming. They gave it to Henry Kissinger. And it's not really regarded as an honest and fair measure of people working for peace. It is simply a little bit of gold that is handed out to somebody, so we'll all pay attention to them and not pay attention to people really working for peace who don't have these awards and accolades. These awards are not really an indication of merit. They're simply part of the propaganda illusion to steer people to pay attention only to those who are serving the state, because they got plaques and gold things all over the walls, and people like Michael Rivero, you don't want to pay attention to them because they don't have, he doesn't have awards and medals and things on, so he's not worth listening to. I mean, that's basically the propaganda value of these awards.
Right. But in this case, Putin was nominated because he did stand between the United States and Syria and war. If it wasn't for Putin, ostensibly we might be able to conclude that we would have troops on the ground in Syria right now, huh?
And probably Iran, because remember, what is driving this whole U.S. war agenda is an attempt to force the world back into the Bretton Woods Agreement to use U.S. dollars only for international trade and banking. That was where much of the U.S. wealth post-World War II came from, because the U.S. economic system gets a piece of the action, just like the mafia, from all global commerce and banking, because if they're using the U.S. dollars, all those dollars start as a loan at interest from the Federal Reserve. And we have got countries have been walking away from the dollar. China has direct currency swaps with 8 nations without going through the dollar. You've got the BRICS nations are setting up their own independent trade currency. They're breaking away from the dollar really faster than the U.S. can reconquer them. But that is what is driving this war, reasserting the petrodollar deal, not just on petroleum nations, but on any nation with mineral resources. That's why they're in Mali. That's why they're in Somalia, all these other countries, so that nobody can buy raw materials without paying for them with U.S. dollars. And unfortunately, our government and economy has propped itself up with this scam for so long. We've actually let our manufacturing decay over the last 30 years. And this disastrous experiment with GMOs, nobody around the world wants to buy our agricultural exports because they're all contaminated. So gaming the system to try and get it back to this Bretton Woods agreement and the petrodollar so that the U.S. automatically gets wealth from everybody's commercial activity around the planet, that's why they're so desperate to force this. And it's an all or nothing deal. It has to be everybody on the planet is roped back into these deals, or the world is simply going to go to those countries that are not trading with the U.S. dollar because prices for the natural resources will be lower. And that's really what's driving this whole war right now.
Well, staying on Ukraine just for a moment longer here, Michael, I want your opinion on this. Let's talk a little bit about Russia's strength. Now, when Kerry and the Obama administration threatened sanctions and are moving forward, I think, on trying to apply sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine, the response from Russia was, oh, okay, well, we're going to sell 200 billion of U.S. treasuries and crash the dollar. How's that sound? To me, that sounds like checkmate.
It's a very credible threat. Russia's currency, especially since Putin took control of their central bank, Russia's currency is very solid. It is backed up by strong manufacturing and agriculture. You can accept the Russian currency anywhere in the world and know you can go back to Russia and get something of real value for it. Same thing with China, which is a powerful manufacturing nation. If you're accepting Chinese currency anywhere in the world, you know you can send it back to China and get manufactured products for it. That is not the case with the United States of America, and that is what really makes the dollar so weak. I think the dollar would have collapsed by now, except it's being propped up with market rigging, game playing, fraud, deception, and of course the threat of U.S. military intervention if you start to play the game by any rules other than those decreed by the United States government.
Last question on Ukraine, and then I'm going to throw it over to Rory, who's prepared some questions for you. Here's my take on what's happening with the Ukraine, and you tell me if I'm right or maybe add to it. You tell me if I'm wrong. NATO and this government want to take control of Ukraine. They want to bring Ukraine into the NATO fold. And part of the reason for that is they're encircling Russia with, I think, what they're calling a defensive missile shield, which Putin sees as an offensive first strike weapon. It certainly would have that capability, and he's right to be fearful of this. Now, when people talk about Ukraine possibly taking us into World War III, I think that's the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that Russia cannot allow itself to be surrounded by a NATO first strike weapon. Am I on the right track?
You're on the right track, but there's another dimension to that. Right now, Russia's only warm water seaports for their naval vessels are in the Crimea. Mm-hmm. And so and remember, this whole situation in the Ukraine started when the elected government of Ukraine, the one that was kicked out, had second thoughts about joining with the European Union. Mm-hmm. Russia made them a much more attractive offer for financial support. And so Yanukovych and his party said, well, we're going to cancel this thing about the European Union because we're looking at what the European Central Bank has done to Greece and France and Spain and Italy, and we're going to go with the Russian deal. And that is when all of these agent provocateurs, U.S. aid, Canvas, apparently Blackwater's up in there now, got into Kiev. These snipers who we now know were working for the coup d'etat were shooting people. The media blamed it on Yanukovych, and Yanukovych agreed to early elections, but the coup plotters couldn't take the chance those elections would go against them. And that is the reason they basically forced the legitimate elected government from power and put this new putsch, this new junta in there, which immediately has sold Ukraine's economic future and prosperity to the International Monetary Fund. And Russia was obviously the threat to their warm water seaports. That's a threat to Russia's strategic interests. And I think, Putin really doesn't want a war, but he understands that if he lets the U.S. go any further, Russia will be in a position of being unable to protect its strategic interests. Basically, it's like when Neville Chamberlain was over there saying, well, let's let Hitler grab a few more little countries and they'll be satisfied. And then they found out, no, that wasn't enough. And it's the same thing with the United States. No matter what you cede to them, they come back and say, we want a little more. And I think Russia has been very patient with U.S. Imperial expansion. But at this point, the move on Ukraine was a threat to Russia's strategic interests, and they had to respond. This would be if, like, say, hypothetically, Iran came in and staged a coup d'etat and overthrew Mexico and said, okay, it's now in the Iranian sphere of influence. How do you think the United States would respond to that? They'd be going right over that border. And speaking of Mexico, last week, of course, we went through another anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. And the situations are really very much the same. Texas wanted to break away from Mexico and was then eventually annexed to the United States of America. And we look at all those people as being heroes. Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and Sam Houston, they're all heroes for breaking Texas away from Mexico and allowing it to be annexed by the United States of America. But we're looking at the Crimea, and actually it's looking more and more like the entire eastern half of Ukraine. Want to break away from this illegitimate coup d'etat government in Kiev and side with Mexico, but we're supposed to think they're the bad people. And we've got the U.S. government is out there talking about Ukraine's territorial integrity. This is the country that split up Vietnam into two pieces, Korea into two pieces, Germany into two pieces. Territorial integrity has never really mattered when it serves U.S. interests. And I think part of that whole global awakening is the American people are looking at these very clearly contradictory statements coming out of the United States. John Kerry is out there saying you can't just invade a country on a made-up pretext, and the world is laughing at him because we all know that the U.S. lied about Saddam having nuclear weapons to justify that invasion. We all know that the U.S. was lying about Syria's President Assad using sarin gas on his own civilians. And the United States is continuing to just absolutely destroy its own credibility around the globe.
Yeah, they look like complete hypocrites. Rory, do you want to go?
Yeah, I do. I want to go back to what you were saying, Sean, about the Russia and the T-bills and the dollars, that they do freeze the treasury bills and the dollars within Russia. Wouldn't that, in essence, be checkmate, which you said, Sean? And don't you see China following suit if they do that? I mean, because China has more.
Yeah, well, China has been slowly selling their treasury bonds now for almost a year. They're trying to get out of their exposure to the U.S. economy. They're doing it slowly to not spark a panic. Now, what Russia has announced they're going to do, they're talking about freezing American assets inside Russia. What they're talking about are all these American business that have set up factories over there. Boeing has a facility inside Russia. Ford has an auto manufacturing plant inside Russia. They're talking about freezing and seizing those. The threat to the dollar and the treasury bill is they're going to dump them onto the world investment market at rock bottom prices. And you're right, China will follow suit. And at that point, with two of the world's largest economies bailing on the treasury bond and bailing on the dollar, that will trigger a panic because every other country is going to start dumping the dollar and the treasury bill so that they don't get stuck holding a whole big stack of worthless paper.
And how does Gazprom and the oil and gas lines that are coming out of Russia through the Ukraine and into Europe, how does that fit into what's going on in Ukraine right now?
There are two dimensions. First of all, Gazprom has been selling Ukraine gas and oil at a very heavily discounted price. Kiev has not been paying the bills, and they missed another deadline for another payment. So Gazprom, just like if you don't pay your gas bill at home, they're going to come over and shut it off, and that's what Russia's talking about now. With regard to Europe, what Russia is saying is that if Europe joins the U.S. in sanctions, against Russia as a whole. So far, the only sanctions that have actually been imposed by the United States are against individual Russians known to be in Syria. It's a very symbolic and rather pointless move by Obama, but he had to look like he's doing something. But if there are general sanctions against Russia, the way we did against Iran, Russia is basically saying they will respond sanction for sanction. And one of the things they can do is Europe imports about 1/3 of their natural gas from Russia through those pipelines going through the Ukraine, and Russia is in a sanctioned environment within their rights to simply shut those valves or simply tell Europe, we're now charging you twice as much. And Europe, because their economy is so fragile after being enslaved to the European Central Bank, they can't survive either one. It's a very credible threat. The other threat, of course, is if there is a ground war in Ukraine, even if Russia doesn't raise gas prices or shut the valves, those pipelines could very easily be destroyed by military action. And again, Europe would be cut off from 1/3 of their natural gas supplies.
With the shale oil and natural gas that we are currently pulling out of the ground over here, how would that play into it, or does that play into it at all? I mean, as far as if they can't get it from Russia, wouldn't we send it in, or would we be able to?
I think that was actually part of the long-term plan, and that was why the U.S. government was allowing British Petroleum and other companies to explore those ultra-deep, high-pressure oil deposits under the Gulf of Mexico. Even before they started drilling, they realized these were very dangerous places to be getting into. But I think the idea is they wanted to bring those oil resources online so the U.S. could tell the rest of the world, we'll cover your oil and gas shortfall when we go into Iran. But so far, that didn't work out very well. We had the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Now, the new coup d'etat government in Kiev has just signed a deal with, I think it's Chevron, to develop shale oil in the Ukraine. So having fracked up the United States of America, now they're going to go over and frack up the Ukrainian ground.
Now, speaking of energy, let's turn our attention here in these few minutes we have left, Mike, to nuclear power and the Fukushima situation. We just did an interview with Patrick Penry, who is, that's his nom de plume, and he has issued a 445-page PDF document that is filled with nothing but FOIA documents that are government documents and NRC regulatory documents, which point to the fact that what's really going on in Fukushima is far more serious and scary than the governments and TEPCO have reported, certainly more scary than maybe the Mockingbird media has reported. That story seems to have been frozen, actually, in the Mockingbird media. They don't talk about Fukushima hardly ever. What's your take on Fukushima right now? What are you hearing being located in Hawaii, and are you concerned about it?
Well, I think everybody ought to be concerned about it. First of all, we know that the Deepwater Horizon disaster toxified the Gulf of Mexico, and it's actually very dangerous to eat the food out of that. The U.S. government is buying Gulf seafood to feed to our troops overseas. I guess they figure they're going to get shot anyway, so the long-term health consequences don't matter. We have known that we have been lied to about Fukushima almost from the start. And what hammered that home for me, remember the huge explosion over reactor number 3? Yeah. And it was this huge cloud that went up in the air. And the official story is it was a hydrogen gas explosion, which hydrogen does build up in these reactors and it can explode. But when hydrogen explodes, it produces water vapor and a white cloud. The cloud that we saw in the photographs over reactor number 3 was this pale, sickly yellow-green, which happens to be the color of the quadrivalent form of plutonium oxide. So at that point, we knew, we were being lied to. We know the U.S. government basically downplayed the disaster from 3 Mile Island. They're certainly downplaying the disasters taking place right now near Carlsbad, New Mexico, and up at the Hanford site in Washington. The only time they made a big deal about a nuclear disaster when it was Chernobyl, and they could use it to bash those gosh darn Russians. But at this point, we are hearing that, yes, indeed, this was a full-on real China syndrome. Fukushima is now the worst nuclear disaster in history. At least 2, possibly more, of the reactor cores did melt down through the bottom of the containment, through the bottom of the dry well, and is down in the groundwater. And there really is not much of a way they can fix this thing. They should have acted far sooner. But everybody was trying to say it's no big deal. It's no big deal. Remember when Ann Coulter was on the corporate media saying a little radiation is good for you? I mean, and of course the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration, the first thing they did was raise the limit for safe exposure to radiation for the American people.
Right.
So last week, the Fukushima radiation is bad for you, and this week, no, it's okay. It's below the new limits. And I remember following the disaster where the FDA went up to Alaska and had a press conference with the Alaska State Fishing Commission and announced that they were absolutely sure the radiation from Fukushima would never reach up to Alaska, and they were not going to be testing Alaskan seafood. They simply declared it safe by imperial edict. Now, if you all remember the TV show Deadliest Catch about the crab fishermen, they did their end of the year wrap up. I think it was 3 years ago. Just 3 years ago, just after the Fukushima disaster. They did their end of the year wrap up down here in Hawaii. And a member of the crew who's a fan of my website invited me down to watch the taping and talk to everybody. And off camera, away from the cameras, all these crab fishermen were basically terrified of some college kid going down to the shore in Alaska, picking up a crab, putting a radiation meter to it, and putting the video on YouTube. Because they understand the currents in the North Pacific are going to be dragging that contaminated water up into the Bering Straits. And as those heavy radioactive isotopes sink down to the bottom, fish that feed on the bottom, whether it's crabs or flounders or what have you, are going to ingest that radioactive material. And what really makes this dangerous, we probably heard a lot about dilution. Oh, don't worry, by the time the radiation is over here, it's just thinned out so much you won't feel it. Well, it doesn't work that way, because a fish that is contaminated right off the coast of Fukushima is still just as contaminated when they swim over to San Diego. And that is the real danger.
Yeah. Well, it's a really frightening situation, and we can let you go here. But I tell you, when you take a look at the explosion of both 3 and 4, which we've played, and we include that in our video in our interview with Hatrick Penry, it's really frightening, because we know that those 1960s designed GE plants were designed to have the spent fuel rods stored in the buildings on top of the reactors, on top of the buildings. So when you see 3 and 4 blow up, one can only conclude that those spent fuel rods blew sky high. It's terrifying if that's what happened.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And one more aspect before I get on out of here. I would not rule out the possibility of the Stuxnet computer virus seriously aggravating what happened in Fukushima, because that virus was designed to infect and disrupt Siemens industrial controllers used in nuclear facilities, in particular those in Iran, the centrifuge plants and their nuclear power station. We know Stuxnet broke into the wild. It was causing damage to factories all over Asia and Russia. We also know that Stuxnet had infected computers in Japan around the Fukushima power plant. And I would not rule out the possibility. We know that many of the safety systems inside Fukushima failed to operate correctly when the disaster happened. And it could very well be that cyber weapon that got loose may have turned a minor calamity into the major catastrophe that it is.
Yeah, we wonder the same thing, and we talked a little bit about the seismic event that happened, an earthquake naturally caused or not, who knows. We don't have to get into that here, but lots and lots of questions, and more often, just like as we saw with the Kiev snipers, a lot of times these things turn out to be what are aptly called false flags. I mean, you know, the official story just never seems to turn out to be true after you do a little digging. Mike, we're just so impressed by the fact that you get on the radio and do 3 hours of top quality radio and information every single day, I guess every single weekday. Can you tell people how they can listen to your most valuable show? I just love it. I listen to it all the time.
Well, my show is carried on the Republic Broadcasting Network. It runs from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Central Time, Monday through Friday. The podcast for each day's show is available for free over at my website, whatreallyhappened.com. And if you don't mind, I'd like to also add a little bit of a blurb here. Starting on Monday, Ben Swan is also on the Republic Broadcasting Network. He has the 2 hours before my show, and it's getting to be a very, very strong lineup.
Oh, it's very exciting. Yeah, we're big fans of Ben Swan's work, too. I guess he was never a Mockingbird journalist, but he did work for sort of the mainstream news, Fox News, and here he is now doing his own thing and doing a very great job getting truth out. So he'll be a great addition to your lineup over there. Well, Mike, thanks so much. We do appreciate your time very, very much, and we love all your work over there at whatreallyhappened.com, too. What a great website.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, Mike.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Bye.